The river was running high with spring melt when Caleb Rourke saw the white cloth snagged on a broken willow branch, flashing against the brown water like a wounded bird. He had been riding fence since dawn, his horse lathered and blowing, his own thoughts heavy with the kind of quiet a man carries when the past weighs more than his saddle. At first he thought it was sheep, fleece, or some fool laundry washed loose, but when the sun struck it just right, he felt something cold slide through his chest, because that cloth was lace, fine and careful, the kind that did not belong to river or range, the kind meant for promises and music and witnesses, not mud and current. He swung down from the saddle and waded in, boots filling, hands shaking, and when he lifted it free, the truth lay bare in his grip. A wedding dress soaked and torn, sleeves trailing like tired wings, and Caleb Rourke knew without knowing how that trouble had just found him. The dress was small, made for a woman not long grown, the lace yellowed where river water had kissed it too long, and there was a dark stain near the hem that might have been silt, or might have been something worse. Caleb spread it over a rock and let the water run off, his jaw set hard as iron. In these parts folks did not throw away wedding dresses. They packed them in cedar chests, passed them down, or buried them with the woman who wore them last. He looked up and down the river banks, half expecting to see tracks or signs of a struggle, but the river kept its own counsel. Still he felt it then, that pull, that sense a man gets when he stands at the edge of something he cannot rightly turn away from. He had lost enough in his life to know the shape of sorrow when it brushed against him. Caleb tied the dress behind his saddle with more care than he had ever given a bedroll, the lace fluttering as he rode, and followed the river upstream where the water narrowed and slowed. He studied the banks like a tracker reads a book. Broken reeds, pressed grass, a heel mark half washed away. Tears had fallen here, he was sure of it. Not the kind you shed in private, but the kind that spill when fear and hope wrestle in the same chest. He thought of the women he had known, strong ones mostly, prairie-made and weather-hardened. None of them would have cast a dress like that into the river unless the world had. Already broken around them as the sun climbed, he found more signs, faint but there, a scrap of white caught on a thorn bush, a footprint smaller than his own heading away from the water, then another, leading toward the low hills where cottonwoods gave way to pine. Caleb felt like an intruder in a story not his own, yet his feet kept moving. His horse followed as if it too understood the gravity of the trail. The air smelled of wet earth and sap, birds lifted at his passing, and somewhere deep inside him an old vow stirred, the kind a man makes when he has once failed to act and sworn never again. By midday the trail turned rough, stones biting through boot leather, the river's voice fading behind him, replaced by the hush of trees. Caleb paused to drink and study the land. There was a cabin up ahead, he guessed, not from sight but from feeling. The way the ground bore marks of human passage, a broken branch cut clean, a fence post long fallen but once set with care. This country did not see many brides, and fewer still who vanished. His mind ran through names, faces from town, none fit, which troubled him more than ignorance should, because it meant she might have been alone in this. No kin near enough to look for her, no husband bold enough to ride after her, or worse, a husband she had reason to flee the path, climbed and narrowed. Tears marked it now, not with water but with loss. Caleb felt them in the quiet, in the way the forest seemed to lean in close. He imagined her here, dressed heavy and ruined, hands shaking as she stripped it off piece by piece, maybe crying, maybe numb. Each step away from the river, a step toward something unknown. His chest tightened at the thought. He had known women cornered by fate, had seen what happened when no one followed. When the world looked away near afternoon, he smelled smoke, faint and clean, not old campfire ash but recent, living. He slowed and eased his revolver free, not because he expected a fight, but because a man learns caution the hard way. Through the trees he saw it then, a small cabin crouched against the slope, roof patched, door shut tight, no horses tied out front, no sound but the wind moving through pine needles. Caleb dismounted and left his horse behind, every step measured, the wedding dress still tied to his saddle like a ghost. Following close, he stopped 10 paces from the door and listened. There was a sound then, soft and broken, a woman crying, not loud but deep, the kind that leaks out when strength is spent. Caleb closed his eyes once, long enough to brace himself. He did not know who she was or what she had fled, but he knew this. He had followed the trail of tears for a reason, and whatever waited behind that door would change both their lives. The river had given up its secret, and now the cabin would demand its answer. Caleb stood there longer than a man should, listening to the quiet break and mend itself inside that cabin. The crying came and went, like a wounded animal testing the air, and with each sound his resolve hardened into something steady and unyielding. He knocked at last, not loud, not soft, just enough to be heard. The sound seemed to echo forever. Then there was movement, a chair scraping, a breath caught sharp as a snagged rein. The door opened, a hand's width, and a face appeared, pale and drawn, eyes red but bright with a fierce kind of fear that refuses to surrender. She held a knife low and tight, the blade trembling, and Caleb raised his hands slow, spoke his name, spoke it plain, told her he meant no harm, that he had found something of hers by the river. Her gaze flicked past him once, twice, searching for men that were not there. Then she sagged just a little, enough for him to see how tired she truly was. She did not invite him in, but she did not close the door either, which felt like permission enough. Caleb told her about the dress, about how it had caught the sun and caught him with it. At the word wedding her jaw tightened and tears welled again. Though none fell, she turned away and pushed the door wider. Retreating into the dim, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and damp wool, of solitude lived too hard and too fast. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed and kept the knife in her lap, not pointed at him now but not set aside either. And finally she spoke, her voice hoarse, as if she had not used it in days. She said her name was Eliza Main, that she had been married that very morning, under a cottonwood tree with a preacher who did not ask questions, and a man who smiled too much and watched too close. Eliza told it slow, stopping often, her words spilling out like water from a cracked cup. She had come west with an uncle who drank himself into an early grave. She had worked kitchens and washed clothes, kept her head down, until a man named Harlan Pike noticed her. He had land, cattle, and a temper folks excused because money speaks loud in small towns. He courted her quick, pressed a ring into her hand before she knew how to refuse, promised safety, a home, a future where she would not have to fear hunger. But even as she spoke the vows, she had seen it in his eyes. The hunger there was not for love but for possession. When he squeezed her hand it hurt. When he kissed her it felt like a claim, not a promise. And when the preacher turned away, Harlan whispered what he expected of her, what she would owe him. And something inside her broke clean in two. She ran before the guests finished eating. Before the fiddle stopped playing, she ran with the dress, snagging and tearing, laughter and shouts fading behind her. She ran until her lungs burned, and the river rose up like a final wall. She said she stood there a long time, thinking the water might be easier than what waited behind her if she went back. But she could not do it, could not let the river take her to. So she stripped the dress off and cast it away like a skin she no longer wanted, followed the hills to a cabin she had once helped build for an old trapper, now long gone. She had been hiding there since, listening for hoofbeats, for Harlan's voice, for the end of whatever hope she still carried. Caleb listened without interrupting, his face hard and still, but something burned behind his eyes. He knew Harlan Pike, had crossed paths once or twice, knew the way men stepped aside for him, knew the stories that never quite surfaced, but lived in the gaps between words. When Eliza finished, she looked at Caleb like a condemned woman watches the hangman, waiting for judgment, for dismissal, for betrayal. Instead he asked one question, simple and quiet. He asked if Harlan knew about the cabin, and when she shook her head, Caleb nodded like a man setting a plan in place. The world outside shifted then, danger taking shape, but so did purpose. Caleb told her he would not leave her there, not alone, not with a man like Pike hunting his pride more than his wife. He offered to take her to town, to the sheriff, but Eliza laughed once, bitter and sharp, said the sheriff drank with Harlan every Friday, and owed him money besides. She said there was no law that would stand for her, only the one a man enforced with his own hands. Caleb accepted that truth because he had learned it young. The law bent easy on the frontier, especially where women were concerned. He told her then of his own past, of a sister buried in unmarked ground because no one followed her cries, because men looked away, because he had been too far gone to hear her. The words cost him, but he paid them anyway. And in that, sharing something settled between them. Fragile but real. Night crept in while they spoke, shadows filling the corners, the fire burning low. Eliza wrapped herself in a blanket and watched Caleb with wary gratitude. He stepped outside to check the trail, his senses sharp. He found fresh tracks just beyond the trees. A man riding hard and careless, confidence in every print. Harlan Pike was closer than Caleb liked, closer than he would admit out loud. He returned to the cabin and told Eliza to pack what little she had, told her they would leave before dawn, head north where the land broke rough and men like Pike did not ride without reason. Fear flared in her eyes, but it was edged now with resolve. She trusted him not because he was strong, but because he stayed. As they settled into an uneasy rest, Caleb sitting by the door, revolver across his knees, Eliza finally slept, her breathing slow and deep with exhaustion. He watched the fire and thought about the dress still tied to his saddle, about how a river could wash away lace but not the truth sewn into it. He knew by morning Harlan Pike would be knocking on that cabin door, or worse, and that the choice he had made would cost him something dear. Yet, as the wind rose and the night pressed close, Caleb Rourke felt no regret, only the heavy calm of a man who has stepped onto a path he was meant to walk. No matter where it led, dawn came thin and grey, the kind that feels more like a warning than a promise. Caleb woke Eliza before the birds stirred. They moved quiet, gathering the few things that mattered: bread wrapped in cloth, a tin cup, a small bundle of letters she had never sent. He cut fresh branches to sweep their tracks, a habit learned young, and led her out back where the trees closed in fast. But the world had already shifted against them. A shout cracked the morning air, sharp with certainty. Harlan Pike's voice carried on the slope like it owned the land. Caleb saw him then through the trees, broad in the saddle, eyes burning, two men riding flanking him. Hired hands or friends, it hardly mattered. What mattered was the look on Harlan's face when he saw Eliza. Not relief, not love, but possession threatened, rage unmasked, and Caleb stepped between them without thinking, his hand resting easy on his revolver, his body already committed to the cost of what came next. Words were exchanged, few and hard. Harlan called Eliza his wife, his property, demanded she return. His men shifted uneasy because even they could feel how close violence stood. Eliza spoke then, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said she was done, said no vow spoken under fear could bind a soul. Harlan laughed and spurred his horse forward, and that was the moment the past caught up with Caleb Rourke, the moment he knew there would be no turning back. The gun came up, smooth as breath. The crack echoed off the hills. Harlan fell heavy into the dirt, not dead but broken enough to stop. His men froze, eyes wide, weighing the law against survival. Caleb told them plain to carry him back and never come looking again. Something in his voice convinced them, maybe the certainty, maybe the truth that some lines once crossed do not uncross clean. They rode north hard, leaving the cabin, the river, the dress behind, the land growing rough and wild beneath them. Eliza rode with her back straight now, fear still there but no longer ruling. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, saw how quickly she learned the rhythm of the trail, how resilience lived in her bones. By nightfall they reached high ground where the air thinned and the world spread wide. They made camp beneath stars sharp as nails, and for the first time since he found the dress in the river, Caleb felt the weight lift just enough to breathe. Eliza spoke then of what she wanted, not much, a place where no one knew her name, work honest and hard, mornings that did not begin with dread. Caleb listened and realized his own wants had shifted. Quietly, without asking permission, days passed, measured by hoofbeats and shared silence. Danger faded into distance. Though Caleb stayed alert, he always would. One night, Eliza asked him why he had followed the trail, why he had not turned away like so many others might have. He told her the truth, about his sister, about the river that had given nothing back, about the vow he made to himself in the empty years after. Eliza reached for his hand then, not as a plea but as an offering, and in that touch something healed that Caleb had not known was still bleeding. They did not speak of love, not yet, but the space between them softened into trust. They found a valley tucked between ridges where grass grew thick and the wind carried no echoes of old names, a place that felt like beginning. Caleb had a few cattle grazing wild there, land he had never settled because he had never thought himself worth settling with. Together they set to work, mending fence, cutting timber, building something that was theirs. Eliza worked alongside him, sleeves rolled, laughter surprising them both when things went wrong. The past did not vanish, it never does, but it loosened its grip, became something they could look at without flinching. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Eliza brought out a small bundle she had carried all that way. Inside was a scrap of lace, clean now, carefully folded, a piece of the wedding dress she had torn away. She held it up to the light and then laid it on the fire, watching it curl and vanish. Not in anger but in release, Caleb stood with her, his arm around her shoulders, understanding that some things must be burned so others can grow. The river had tried to claim her story, but she had written a new ending instead. Months later, folks would say Caleb Rourke settled at last, that he found a woman as strong as the land itself. They would never know the whole truth about the trail of tears, about the gunshot that changed everything, about the dress pulled from the river like a ghost asking to be seen. But Caleb and Eliza knew, and that knowing bound them stronger than any vow spoken under cottonwood branches ever could. And sometimes, when the spring melt ran high and the river sang its restless song, Caleb would stand on the bank with Eliza beside him, watch the water rush past, and think about how fate moves quiet until it doesn't, how one man riding fence can stumble into another soul's salvation, and how following a trail of tears had led them both home, not to the place they were born, but to the life they chose, together.